Yes, we are on air. Oh, okay. So thank you for being there, for preparing. Good morning, everybody. And today, again, we have Timothy Langley, the Chief Executive Officer of Langley Esquire, a public policy company in Tokyo. And he's going to brief us about the events and happenings in Japanese politics during the past week. He is in the beautiful harbor of Katsuyama. So we are live streaming from Tokyo and Katsuyama at the same time. Thank you very much for joining us. After finishing this briefing, Timothy is going to move to Clubhouse and we'll continue the discussion there. So everybody who is listening on Clubhouse or who is on YouTube or LinkedIn, please join us on Clubhouse later. You can also comment. We can see your comments and address them after we finish the briefing during the live streaming and move to Clubhouse. Timothy, so the floor is yours.
Thank you, Maya. Good morning, and good morning to everybody who's joining us on our weekly update on what's going on in Japanese politics. We do this on Sunday, and typically Saturdays and Sundays are our days off, and I do this while I'm pursuing my pastime, my hobby of picking up sailing skills and working on the boat. So I broadcast from the deck of the good ship Santana out in Katsuyama, and I appreciate you tolerating this so that we can get through the briefing and just do this every week. We've been doing this for more than a year, Maya, and the audience just continues to grow. So thank you very much for everybody being interested in what's going on in Japanese politics. For many people who are not that familiar with what's going on in Japanese politics or Japanese politics in general, there's probably an ingrained prejudice about old guys and loud suits and nothing ever happens and it's all about money politics and the LDP runs everything. To some degree, there's some truth in that, but also it is politics. It is how the country runs, how things are decided, and it's important to keep a careful eye on what's going on there because it means something and it happens, quicker than you expect. So what I'd like to do is talk about the major points that I discussed last week, just to give you a bit of perspective, and then move on to the major points this week. I'd like to make my briefing as concise as possible, 30 minutes, and then open it up to question and answers. We'll move from the live stream onto Clubhouse exclusively. And just as a technical issue, I think Maya has already explained that since I don't have good Wi-Fi here in the harbor, I'm broadcasting my voice through Maya's microphone. So the sound is not so great, although the visuals are. But once we go on to Clubhouse, the audio increases substantially. So from there, let's move on. Last week, we talked about a couple of things. The elections in South Korea. The opposition party candidate won by a very slim, narrow margin, less than 2% of a margin there. There were three candidates. The third candidate was a spoiler. The people that would have voted for the government candidate, the votes were taken away from him, and as a consequence, the opposition party candidate won. He is a little bit more friendly towards Japan, it is perceived, and so he's been in office now for a week, and there's a lot of excitement and interest in how that relationship is going to develop. He's already made overtures. His first foreign trip will be to the United States, and on his return to Japan, to Tokyo. That is in the planning stages right now. But the importance of the relationship between Korea and Japan is so important to the United States and to the overall policy implications of how we deal with what's going on with China and Taiwan, in the Asia Pacific, is so vitally important. So there's a lot of emphasis being put on that. One of the issues that confront Japan is how they deal with North Korea. So there've been some developments there that I'd like to talk about. But that was the issue last week. We also talked about the anniversary of 3/11, the triple disaster that happened 12 years ago, and the impacts and the lingering effects of that, including the accumulated water that's being stored at Fukushima and the potential release of that, not the potential release, the actual release of that. It is being scheduled for sometime next year. I suspect some of it is already happening quietly anyway. It has impacted the relations between the farmers and the producers of vegetables and fruits, which are very high value added throughout the rest of Asia. Those fruits and vegetables and foodstuffs being eliminated from trade because of the lingering effects of radiation poisoning, or the specter of radiation poisoning. Japan has made great strides in reducing those, and now all of a sudden we have the same issue with the release of the water, and people getting angry about that, as maybe is understandable. We talked about that. We talked about the entry cap for foreigners coming into Japan. It has been very restricted. The Japanese government has decided to increase that from 5,000 per day to 7,000, and that was the news last week. In the span of 1 week, it has changed considerably. There's a lot more news going on there. There's a lot of pressure moving to open the doors and to allow this trade flow to begin coming in. The economy is really starting to reveal the strain that COVID has had on it. And like many other countries, Japan is trying to address that by releasing and reducing the restrictions on COVID. And we're seeing a lot of action there this week. We talked also about Mr. Kishida's proposal to have yet another supplementary budget to deal with the fifth wave of COVID, which we're just emerging from right now. The economy has taken a big hit there, and he has proposed another just unbelievable amount of money to stimulate the economy. The economy is in the doldrums. It doesn't have much of a chance of surviving by itself and reestablishing some sort of vibrancy without government help. And so that was the proposal that was discussed last week. There was quite a bit of discussion about North Korea launching 2 missiles, ballistic missiles, in February, and the concern that has caused. There's been some new developments there that I'm going to talk about. Last week, Mr. Abe traveled to Malaysia to celebrate the 56th establishment of diplomatic relations. And this was a pretty big trip for him, the former prime minister, still attempting to keep his position as the chief diplomat in Japan. Although Mr. Hayashi is foreign minister, Mr. Kishida is the prime minister, Mr. Abe is still attempting, and very successfully, promoting and protecting and projecting his own influence in foreign policy. And I think you're going to see more of that, and you're going to see more of this rift between the Abe group, the Abe faction, and people who are close and familiar with the Abe faction, and Mr. Kishida and the several factions that are aligned with him. There's a couple of feuds going on right now that have implications to what we're going to be seeing as the upper house election approaches us. We talked about Mr. Kishida's political faction and the grouping of factions that are familiar and close to him as opposed to those that aren't. There's basically a Kishida group and then an Abe group, and the alignment of those forces continues, and we can see that, we can read into it by decisions that are being made and meetings that are had that people are invited to or that are not invited to, and how different policy issues are addressed. So as you know, the Diet is in session. It's been in session all this week. They meet daily in the budget committee room. It's televised, and so issues of controversy and policy are brought up pretty frequently and exposed to the rifts that are in politics, but also it shows us that there are little areas where the opposition parties are collaborating with the LDP. There are a couple of important issues that happened last week with gas prices. The Democratic People's Party head addressed with Mr. Kishida that issue and received some concessions so that his party his political party, although in opposition, would receive some sort of recognition for promoting this and having, all Japanese people benefiting from the gas price triggers, the cap on gas prices associated with this political party. And in exchange for that, Mr. Kishida got something. We're not quite sure what it was, but it sure scared Komeito. Komeito is the junior coalition partner in the LDP coalition. And there's a little bit of nervousness there. Ever since Mr. Abe, Mr. Suga left the stage, Mr. Kishida is not as familiar with the Komeito relationship. And there's been some missteps there. And Komeito is beginning to feel a little bit of loss of love. And so a couple of elections have occurred. Last week was the election for Ishikawa, where one of Mr. Abe's lieutenants was running there, a former minister of education under Mr. Abe. And the schism between the LDP and Komeito is apparent in these gubernatorial and these by-elections that happen. And they're kind of suggestive of what's going to happen in the upper house election. So people watch this very carefully. That election was called last week. Mr. Abe had actually two candidates from his political faction running in the same race. It was something he couldn't prevent. He had to go along with it, but his candidate won. The favor of him, the political machine in the prefecture had their own candidate, which was a little bit different from Mr. Abe, so there was a problem there. But Komeito brings voters to elections, and that's why they're so very important. The fact that the Democratic People's Party is beginning to cozy up begins to shake a little bit of confidence. Isshin no Kai is also kind of becoming more important and developing inroads into what is potentially LDP territory, as they did in the lower house election, where they really did almost a clean sweep in Osaka. We talked about the defections in political factions within the LDP. So when you're talking about Japanese politics, you're talking about the LDP, and the LDP is comprised of 6 factions, maybe 7 factions pretty soon, because of Mr. Suga attempting to form his own group and maybe form a faction. But whenever there's a defection, or whenever a political faction grows by even one, it's a pretty big deal. So last week reported that Tado Aso's faction lost not 1, 2, but 4 members who defected, who just said, "We're out of here. We're going to do something else." That was a pretty big deal. At the point in time last week, we didn't know what they were going to do. Were they going to just be independents? Were they going to join another faction? There's been some movement there, and I'd like to address that. And we talked about Ishikawa. Obviously, the results were not in last week, but that's a pretty big one. Shionogi is a pharmaceutical company that came up with a vaccine that is somewhat similar to Pharma and Moderna, and it is rushing to push that into the market. That's a pretty big piece of news for a local manufacturer to produce a vaccine that addresses COVID and COVID variants. There's been some real progress there. As you can imagine, the amount of money that is being spent by Japan outflowing to bring those vaccines in on an accelerated basis. The desire for the Japanese to have a homegrown version is very strong. So there's been a lot of effort, a lot of money poured into that, and we're beginning to see the results of that now. And finally, we talked about the gerrymandering in Japanese politics that is required by the Supreme Court because of the disparity of votes in highly populated areas versus low populated areas. In the rural areas, younger people are moving out and going to the bigger metropolis, the larger cities, and there has not been a redistribution of the number of politicians in those election districts. The Japanese Supreme Court has ordered the politicians to address that issue because they are in a state of unconstitutionality. And the decision to do that comes up at the end of this month. There is a recommendation that is required within the LDP to present to the Prime Minister on how that redistribution should occur. Excuse me. It turns out that about 196 politicians within the LDP alone are potentially impacted on how that issue is decided. So if they stay with the status quo, these 196 members of parliament in the LDP now probably have a safe bid. They're somewhat secured in the next election for the lower house. This is dealing with the lower house election, by the way. It won't have an impact in this upper house election. But the deal initially was that they would take 3 seats or 5 seats from the lower populated areas and distribute them into the higher populated for Osaka, for Tokyo, Kanagawa, Chiba, Fukuoka. And the decision there is it's going to be presented and revealed to us probably at the end of this month. And it looks like they're just going to kick the ball down the road in spite of the Supreme Court direction to address that issue. It becomes a political issue, and it will be a hot political issue. I think the Japanese voting population is not going to like what the politicians have decided in light of that, but it remains to be seen. And it comes just before the upper house election. So it is a delicate issue. I'll continue to report on that. Moving on, what's gone on since then over this last week? As I said, the Diet has been in session, so we can see politics being decided and issues being addressed every day. And there's been a lot of movement. Top on the news is what's going on in Ukraine, obviously. And the Japanese government, in concert with a lot of the other G7 and other countries who are, supporting the United States and several of the other countries on dealing with the Russia-Ukraine situation, are opening their doors to the refugees and the people who are displaced in Ukraine. This is just really amazing that in Japan, a country that is really reluctant to accept refugees or people for amnesty, it's remarkable how tight they are. And indeed, even bringing foreigners in, the visa restrictions and the difficulty of accommodating people and making Japan or Tokyo even a financial capital, all of the cultural and linguistic restrictions that are part of what Japan is, to see the amount of openness that the government has had for the Ukrainian refugees. So last week I reported that Tokyo Governor Koike had announced that 100 homes would be made available for free for Ukrainian refugees, potentially exceeded to 500, and that has continued apace. Now the Japanese government has picked up the ball, and now visa restrictions for Ukrainian refugees, it is just astounding. The door has been opened because of COVID restrictions to reduce the number, or to increase the number from 5,000 per day to 7,000, and it is increasing even beyond that. But the number of refugees coming in from Ukraine are beyond that, so they are not included in that cap. So it's almost like, come on, you can come in. We're here to help you come in, leave your country, find a place to live and work. Visa restrictions have been dropped even for COVID. If they have a COVID, they don't have to have a COVID test. They don't have to be tested negative for COVID to be accepted into the country. They'll receive shots when they come here. It is really just astounding how open Japan has become for Ukrainian refugees. And I think we're going to see more and more of that. Excuse me. I think that is being encouraged by the United States and other countries who are similarly trying to address that humanitarian issue. And I think the Japanese government also sees an opportunity for a role for it to play in how this issue is resolved and how it's accommodated at the international level. The Prime Minister will go to Brussels next week on Thursday to join the G7 to talk about Japan's response to Ukraine and the Russian incursions there. There's actually a lot going on with regard to Russia from Japan. The increased sanctions that they're implying or they're implementing there, what's going on in Hokkaido, the gas and liquefied petroleum that's coming into Japan, how they're dealing with that. So I think you're going to see a lot more movement here and a lot more humanitarian aid. The Japanese government, through the United States Air Force, flew relief supplies into Ukraine just this last week. Interestingly enough, they didn't use self-defense forces vehicles to transport that. They piggybacked on the United States, but in fact, the shipment wasn't, it was 3 truckloads, so it wasn't enough, I guess, to justify a full flight. But you're going to be seeing more of that, and apparently the entire parliament is in line with that. Consumer prices are rising rapidly, and we reported last week the prospect of price hikes overall, which Japan has largely escaped, but it looks like it's going to be coming here. It's unavoidable. Although the Bank of Japan, Mr. Kuroda, has attempted for the last 8 years to push inflation to around a 2% level. It looks like now that in spite of his efforts to do that, it is now racing forward and it will exceed 2% this year. April is the big time to look at consumer prices. It's also the time when the Japanese businesses announce what their wage hikes are going to be. Most of those decisions have already been made. The LDP wants things smooth. They want to move into the upper house election. By the way, we're less than 100 days away from the upper house election. So you're going to start seeing a lot more acceleration of movement to get the Japanese population liking the LDP, liking Mr. Kishida. And you're going to see more and more of that. Actually, last week we reported a little bit about the declining popularity of Mr. Kishida. This week, his numbers have come up. His disapproval rating has been reduced significantly just over the span of 1 week. And that is because of, number one, his toughness on Russia with regard to Ukraine. And number two, his treatment of the gas prices in Japan. So those 2 issues have really pushed him forward. And they had the Ldp Convention on Sunday last week, where all of the members of the parliament who belong to the Ldp got together in a big ballroom. They talked about the policies, they talked about the election, they talked about what they're going to do. Mr. Kishida pronounced pretty strongly what his objectives are in leading up to the election, and I think they're important to reply to you. So he is going to bolster defenses throughout Japan in light of what's going on in China and also Ukraine. So probably that means the purchase of more and higher end defensive capabilities from the United States, because Japan produces so little of that. He's going to revise the Constitution. He's going to move more issues towards the revision of the Constitution. So that will be a campaign pledge. He will do more to condemn Russia and their incursion into Ukraine. He wants to spend a lot of money on returning to normal as quickly as possible once we have a better handle on COVID. And you can see even that promise, that commitment even today. And he wants to mitigate the gas prices for Japanese consumers. He's made great progress even in the span of 1 week on 2 of those issues. The gas prices, there's a lot of talk about a trigger price mechanism, which would mean that the Japanese government would reduce the taxes that it collects on sales of gasoline. But also there's a price, about a 178 yen per liter. Once it exceeds that, the Japanese government starts to kick in money. It's a subsidy of 25 yen per liter. So that relief has already started. It's already started flowing to consumers now. And the trigger price is being discussed. It'll probably be resolved probably within the next 2 weeks, because even just talking about that sort of thing tends to boost up Mr. Kishida's approval rating. So he's motivated to do that. There was a trial balloon that was floated up. You might be interested to know. The LDP proposed sending 5,000 yen to the older people in Japan, just another gift, as we saw earlier with families with children just before the new year. This is another kind of, it's not a gimmick, but sounds something like a gimmick, and it is called out as a gimmick. So this trial balloon was raised and it fell down because the opposition party said it is just to enhance your likelihood of the elder people who are largely, they consistently vote and they vote largely for the LDP, but to make them more favorable to the LDP in the upcoming upper house election. It doesn't look like that subsidy is going to fly, but it was floated out. There are a couple of things that come up from time to time, trial balloons. Sometimes they have the force of momentum, and sometimes they're immediately shot down. So, but it does help tell you what the government is thinking, what Mr. Kishida is thinking. North Korea, once again in the news, it fired a ballistic missile on Wednesday. Fortunately, it was a flop. It did not reach its trajectory. It blew up halfway through before its second booster ignited, and debris was scattered in some places in the capital city. But the continuing march of the North Korean leader to get ballistic missile technology, satellite technology, it continues unabated. For a long time, there was a hiatus there. Mr. Trump somehow was able to calm that growth. That has changed, and the number of missiles fired just over the last 6 months has been pretty remarkable. So there is a lot of concern there. The fact that they had a missile launch just this last week, that's 3 in probably a 4-week period. So it is something of a concern. And it also tells the Japanese and the Japanese Defense Ministry that they need to do more. So the revision of the Constitution, one of the key points there is to take Japan off of a purely defensive posture and have it more offensive in nature, or at least to bolster it. One of the other issues that has come up as a consequence of that is a consideration of sharing nuclear weapons positioning with the United States. That was a huge taboo, as you know, that Japan and the 3 principles of non-proliferation were no production, no hosting, and no visitation of nuclear weapons on Japanese soil. The LDP has floated the idea that maybe, in fact, it's Mr. Abe who floated the idea to rethink that and to perhaps host or co-share a nuclear weapons hosting with the United States. For many, this is an unacceptable diversion. Mr. Kishida, Prime Minister, is from Hiroshima. Don't forget that. So he is going to be in opposition to that, but Mr. Abe is very strongly motivated, and also the Chief Policy Secretary within the LDP, Sanai Takaichi, is also promoting that. So there's a lot of tension even within the LDP, even within the administration of Mr. Kishida. The sanctions against Russia are increasing incredibly. This is one of the things that has promoted Mr. Kishida's not so much his likability, but it's diminished his the negativity, the people who say I really don't like him, rather than saying that I support him or I like him. So those numbers really took a dive this last week, and it's because he's been tough on Russia on the sanctions, mostly with trade, a kind of trade embargo. But that's what the other countries are doing. Japan is pretty much following suit. Japan really doesn't have a vibrant trade policy with Russia. There's probably maybe $100 billion worth of trade each year, mostly in seafood, salmon, urchin trade. There are a couple of issues, but mostly it's dominated by oil and gas. But otherwise, the trade is not that vibrant. So it's not going to take that big of a hit, but it feels good, and it accommodates what the other EU countries are doing as well. As I said, the Prime Minister will leave for Brussels next week. He's actually in India now. He's on a 2-nation trip, India and Cambodia. He will return on Tuesday and get back to work here. But the relationship between Japan and India is pretty significant with regard to Quad. And we've had discussions about Quad. If you're interested in how that is going, probably you should tune into Stephen Nagy's show on Monday nights, every other Monday night. I'm not sure, Maya, when that next show is coming on. I think it might be this Monday. But the Quad has 4 countries, 3 of which are pretty much engaged, and Mr. Modi of India is not as engaged. It's a complex relationship between him and Russia and the other Quad countries. So the fact that Mr. Kishida is there is pretty important. I wonder what will come out of that. Also, Japan decided to take most favored nation status from Russia, so the trade benefits that countries receive under equal treatment has been reduced. And also, as Japan is going through a new national security law, new national security defense policy, rewriting that. It's very rare to be rewritten. It's being rewritten this year, and it's unfortunate that all of these things happened this year because Russia is going to suffer in that as well, not be treated as a favored nation, not being treated as an ally or as a friendly nation. Mr. Kishida also went on remarkably to say that Russia is illegally occupying the 4 northern territories. This is a big division from what was said earlier. It was usually just soft pedaled. They didn't make much of a deal of it. Mr. Abe spent a lot of time trying to schmooze with Mr. Putin to have some sort of an accommodation, maybe joint development on 2 of the islands, but not 4. He spent a lot of political capital there. It looks like Mr. Kishida is not going to follow that. He has said, publicly that those are illegally held. We're still not in. We haven't signed a peace treaty with Russia, and it looks like things are going to get a little bit tougher before they get a little bit nicer. COVID quarantine. You might have heard that of the 18 prefectures that are currently under quasi-emergency are going to be reduced tomorrow on Monday. So all of the prefectures that were under quasi-emergency are being released. And the reason for that is because the number of infections due to COVID, due to the Omicron variant, have been reduced during an artificially set number. And once it goes below that, then the Prime Minister has said, unless the prefecture feels somewhat nervous about it, you'll be released from that. So all of the prefectures that were under that kind of cover of administration will be released. Not only that, but the Prime Minister has said that the Go To campaign on a limited basis will be reinitiated on April 1st. So that's less than 2 weeks away. That's a big deal. So there are baby steps for Go To within prefectures, and within prefectures that are in particular geographic blocks, there will be Go To travel administered within that block. But it's not internationally. It's not throughout the entire nation. It's on prefectural level mostly, but it is going to begin. So you can see these things beginning to happen. And I think the Japanese are really eager for that to happen. The economy, as I said earlier, is beginning to show real strain. So they have to take care of that. Let me see, the vaccine advances, as I talked earlier about Shionogi, the pharmaceutical company that has come up with a vaccine that can compete with Moderna and the other Pfizer vaccines. They have come up with one, and it's not just Shionogi that has a vaccine that is coming up through trials right now, but it's also Medicago and Daiichi Sankyo have also come up with variants. Medicago is a joint venture with Mitsubishi and another Japanese company, pharmaceutical company. They have a product that's gone through trials and will be administered in Canada next week. It hasn't been admitted into Japan. The regulations and the rules here are a little bit tighter, but it is going through trials on a fast track. And so in very quick order, we could have 2 or 3 different vaccines available that are produced in Japan. This is a pretty big deal and a significant accomplishment by the Japanese. So you're going to hear more about that. This is just being released this last week. And I think you can expect to see more in the medical field on vaccines that are offered here in Japan. There are a lot of other issues that are going on. I think I've covered most of the top ones. There's much more to talk about, but I think I've gone on long enough, Maya. I'd like to open the floor for questions and other people's comments who have issues that I haven't touched upon, and so we can get into a wider dialogue on that.
Yes, definitely. Thank you very much for the briefing. I believe that we still have, half an hour to go, but I'll let you go from the live stream. And could you please sign into Clubhouse so that we can continue the discussion there? By the way, the amount of your rouge was really perfect today. The light was very nice. So
I spent a lot of time on it. Thank you, Maya.
Great result. Thank you, Timothy. So see you on the other side.
Thank you, everybody, for participating in this briefing. We're going to move over to the Clubhouse side and see you there. Thank you, Maya.
Thank you.